The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a sky gone mad with lightning. Thunder rolled across the Badlands like artillery fire, and Josiah McBride stood on his porch watching the storm tear the world apart. He'd built this ranch 12 years ago, choosing the most God-forsaken patch of land he could find 40 miles from the nearest town, hidden in a valley where even the hawks didn't bother to circle. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold, but he didn't move to refresh it. Movement meant acknowledging time, and time was something he'd learned to let pass without marking. The storm suited him fine. It matched the perpetual tempest that had raged in his chest since the morning he'd found Rebecca in their bed with another man, since the fever had taken little William just 3 months later, since everything he'd believed about love and family and purpose had turned to ash. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the landscape in stark relief. Sagebrush and stone his weathered barn, the creek swollen with runoff. That's when he saw her. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks. 12 years of solitude could do that to a man, make him see things that weren't there. But the figure stumbling through the mud toward his porch was real enough. White fabric whipped around her like a surrender flag, and even from 50 yards away he could see she was in trouble. Josiah set down his cup with deliberate care, his muscles tensing with an old instinct he thought he'd buried. The figure collapsed 20 feet from his steps, crumpling into the mud like a shot bird. The white fabric spread around her, and he realized with a jolt that sent ice through his veins it was a wedding dress. He stood frozen, watching the rain pound against the still form. His mind cataloged details with the detached precision of his former life, expensive silk now ruined, intricate beadwork on the bodice, lace that would have cost more than most folks saw in a year. This wasn't some farmer's daughter. This was money lying face down in his yard, and in his experience money always came with complications. "Leave her," the voice in his head whispered. "Go inside. Lock the door. In the morning she'll be gone one way or another." But his feet were already moving, carrying him down the steps into the driving rain. Each step felt like a betrayal of the walls he'd spent 12 years building. The rain soaked through his shirt, instantly cold as judgment against his skin. When he reached her, he could see she was breathing shallow, desperate gulps that barely moved her ribs. He knelt beside her, the mud seeping through his worn denims. Up close, he could make out details the distance had hidden: dark hair plastered to her skull, delicate features that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion carved into every line. She couldn't be more than 25, maybe younger, the kind of age where women still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. His voice came out like rusted gate hinges. When had he last spoken to another human being? 3 months ago, when he'd ridden to town for supplies. 4. No response. Her lips were blue with cold, and when he pressed 2 fingers to her neck, her pulse fluttered weak and rapid as a hummingbird's wings. The storm was getting worse, sheets of rain moving across the valley like cavalry charges. If he left her here, she'd be dead by morning. Hell, she might be dead by morning anyway. Josiah looked back at his cabin, warm, dry, safe. Everything he'd built to keep the world and its pain at arm's length. Then he looked down at the woman in the wedding dress, this stranger who'd somehow found the one place in the Wyoming Territory where she wasn't supposed to be able to find anyone. A crack of lightning illuminated her left wrist where the lace had torn away. Purple-black bruises wrapped around the delicate bones like shackles, and Josiah's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. He knew those marks, had seen them too many times during his years wearing a badge. Someone had held her down, held her hard enough to leave evidence that would last for days. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered, scooping her up with an ease that surprised him. She weighed nothing, a bundle of wet silk and desperation. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught the faint scent of lavender beneath the rain and mud. Expensive perfume. Another sign that this woman came from a world he'd deliberately left behind. He carried her up the steps and through his door, water streaming from both of them onto the pine boards he'd laid with his own hands. The cabin was sparse, one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs he'd never needed. He laid her on the buffalo hide rug near the fire, close enough to warm her, but not so close she'd burn. She stirred slightly as the heat reached her, a soft moan escaping her lips. In the firelight, Josiah could see more bruises, finger marks on her throat, a swollen area near her temple that was already turning purple. Someone had done more than just grab her wrists. Someone had tried to break her. He moved with automatic efficiency, pulling the quilts from his bed, stoking the fire higher. The wedding dress had to come off. It was soaked through and would only keep her cold. But the thought of undressing an unconscious woman, even to save her life, made his hands hesitate. Rebecca's clothes, he remembered suddenly. He'd kept one trunk shoved under the bed where he wouldn't have to see it. Couldn't bring himself to burn it, couldn't bear to look at it. Now, 12 years later, necessity overrode sentiment. He dragged out the trunk, lifting the lid to reveal carefully folded dresses, undergarments a life interrupted. The fabric still smelled faintly of the rose water Rebecca had favored. Josiah grabbed what he needed and closed the trunk quickly, as if the memories might escape and contaminate his carefully maintained emptiness. The woman's eyes fluttered open just as he was laying out the dry clothes, green as spring grass after rain, wide with panic that shifted quickly to terror. She tried to scramble backward, but her body wouldn't cooperate, limbs weak as a newborn colt's. "Easy," Josiah said, holding up both hands, showing her the clothes. "You're safe. Just need to get you warm and dry." Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Those green eyes darted around the cabin, cataloging exits, threats, possibilities. He recognized the look, prey searching for escape routes. "Name's Josiah McBride," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "This is my place. You collapsed out front. Storm's bad and you're half frozen. I'm going to step outside while you change into these dry things. There's water heating on the stove and soup if you can manage it." He moved to the door, slow and deliberate. "I'll knock before I come back in. Take your time." Outside, the rain had turned to hail, ice pellets bouncing off the porch boards like scattered dice. Josiah stood under the overhang, giving her privacy while keeping watch on the horizon. In 12 years, no one had found this place who wasn't meant to. Now, a woman in a wedding dress had stumbled out of nowhere, bearing the marks of violence and desperation. He thought about the revolver hanging on the peg just inside the door, the rifle propped in the corner. Thought about the kind of trouble that would make a woman run into a storm like this in wedding finery. The kind of trouble that might follow her. When enough time had passed, he knocked. "Ma'am, you decent?" "Yes." The voice was hoarse, barely audible. He entered to find her huddled in Rebecca's blue calico dress, the wedding gown hanging from a chair like a ghost. She'd wrapped herself in one of the quilts and positioned herself in the corner, where she could see both the door and window. Smart. Whoever she was running from had taught her hard lessons about survival. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door." "Haven't brought anything yet but rain," Josiah replied, though they both knew that was a lie. Trouble had a way of following desperate people, and this woman had desperation written in every line of her body. He ladled soup into a bowl, venison and vegetables from his garden, and set it on the table. She approached like a wild animal, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. When she sat, he noticed how her hands shook, lifting the spoon. "Been riding long?" he asked, settling into the opposite chair with careful distance between them. "Since yesterday morning." She took a tentative sip, and her eyes closed briefly in what might have been relief. "Maybe longer," Hard to tell. Where from? She hesitated, spoon halfway to her mouth. Does it matter? Might if someone comes looking. Someone will come looking. She set down the spoon, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. Garrett Blackwood doesn't let his property wander off. The name hit Josiah like a physical blow. Garrett Blackwood, Silver Baron Cattle King, and the kind of man who collected judges and sheriffs, like some men collected guns. The kind of man who could make people disappear without anyone asking questions. You were supposed to marry Blackwood. He kept his voice neutral, but his mind was already calculating distances, defensive positions, how many men Blackwood might send. This morning, or yesterday morning, I'm not sure anymore. She touched her throat unconsciously, fingers finding the bruises. My brother owes him money, gambling debts. I was the payment. The old anger stirred in Josiah's chest, the righteous fury that had once made him believe a badge meant something. He'd thought that part of him had died with his faith in justice, but apparently some embers still smoldered. What's your name? Isabel Hartford. She laughed, a broken sound. Though I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. Daniel, my brother, he tried to stop it, stood up in the church and said I was being forced. Blackwood had him beaten bloody right there in front of God and everyone. Josiah felt the weight of what was coming like storm pressure in his bones. Blackwood wouldn't just let this go. Men like him never did. They'd track her here eventually, and when they did, "You picked a hell of a place to run to," he said. "I didn't pick anything. I just ran." Isabel pulled the quilt tighter. "The storm hit when I was in the foothills. My horse threw me and bolted. I walked until I saw your light." She paused. "I'll leave as soon as the storm breaks. I don't want to bring his wrath down on you." "Storm won't break before morning," Josiah said, "and you're in no shape to travel, even if it did." They sat in silence, listening to the hail hammer against the roof. Josiah found himself studying her face in the firelight, seeing past the exhaustion to something that might have been strength. It took courage to run from a man like Blackwood. Foolish courage, maybe, but courage nonetheless. "Why here?" he asked finally. "Why'd you run west? Cheyenne's east could have caught a train." "He owns the railroad officials in Cheyenne, owns most everything east of here." She met his eyes again. West was the only direction he might not expect, the only direction where his money might not reach quite so far. Smart and desperate, a dangerous combination. Josiah stood moving to the window where he could see nothing but rain and darkness. Somewhere out there, riders were probably already searching. By morning, they'd have found her trail. By tomorrow night, they'd be here. "Mr. McBride," Isabel said quietly, "you've been kind to a stranger, kinder than you had to be. But I know what you're thinking, and you're right. Come morning, I'll move on. Find somewhere else." "No." The word came out before he could stop it. "You'll stay until you're strong enough to travel proper, and if Blackwood comes looking well..." He turned from the window. "I've dealt with his kind before." "You don't know what you're saying. He's not just rich, he's..." "I know exactly what he is." Josiah's voice carried an edge sharp as winter wind. "Question is, do you trust me enough to stay put and let me handle it?" Isabel studied his face for a long moment. This strange man who lived alone in the wilderness, who'd taken her in without questions or conditions. Something in his eyes, a darkness that matched her own, made her nod slowly. "I don't even know you," she whispered. "No," Josiah agreed. "But sometimes that's better than the devils we do know." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would test whether a man who'd given up on justice could find it in himself to fight for it one more time, and whether a woman who'd run from one kind of captivity had found sanctuary or simply traded one prison for another. The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the Wyoming sky when Josiah heard them coming. He'd been expecting it, had spent the pre-dawn hours cleaning his rifle and checking the loads in his Colt 45. Isabel slept fitfully on the bed he'd insisted she take while he kept watch from a chair by the window. The riders came from the east, 5 of them moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. Josiah recognized the formation spread wide enough to prevent escape, close enough to support each other if shooting started. Professional manhunters, not common ranch hands. "Isabel," he kept his voice low but urgent, "company's coming." She jerked awake, fear flooding her eyes before she'd even fully focused. "How many are 5? Still a few minutes out." He moved to the gun rack, taking down the Winchester. "There's a root cellar behind the pantry, hidden door under no." She stood still, wearing Rebecca's dress, her chin lifted with a stubbornness he was beginning to recognize. "I won't hide while you face them alone." This isn't a debate. He checked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "These men aren't here to talk. They're here for me. That makes it my fight." Josiah turned to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Not fear anymore, but determination mixed with a resignation that said she'd made peace with whatever came next. He'd seen that look before, usually in men about to make their last stand. "Can you shoot? My father taught me." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Before the debts, before everything went to hell." He handed her his spare revolver, a Navy Colt he'd carried during the war. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and he felt something electric pass between them. Recognition maybe of kindred spirits who'd both been broken by the world. The horses stopped just beyond rifle range. Josiah counted 5 men just as he'd thought. The one in front sat his horse like he owned the ground beneath it. Tall, lean, wearing a black duster that probably cost more than most men made in a year. When he removed his hat to wipe his brow, Josiah saw silver threading through dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of the mouth. "That's Marcus Pike," Isabel whispered from behind him. "Blackwood's right hand. He's the one who—" She touched her wrist unconsciously. "Josiah McBride," Pike called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards." Josiah stepped onto the porch, rifle casual in his hands, but ready. "Don't believe I know any Blackwood. You boys are on private property." Pike smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Come now, Mr. McBride, or should I say Sheriff McBride. Oh yes, we know all about you. The lawman who lost his wife and his nerve, ran off to hide in the mountains like a wounded animal." The words were calculated to provoke, to make him angry and sloppy. Josiah had used the same tactics himself once upon a time. Ancient history. State your business or move along. Our business is the woman. Miss Hartford suffered a nervous episode yesterday. Ran off in a state of confusion. Her fiancé is deeply concerned for her welfare. Pike leaned forward in his saddle. Naturally, there's a reward for her safe return. $500 could go a long way toward improving this rustic accommodation. "Haven't seen any woman," Josiah replied. "Storm was too bad yesterday for traveling." "Interesting." Pike dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting near his gun. "Because we tracked her horse to about 3 miles from here. Found it this morning still saddled. And wouldn't you know, the tracks in the mud led right to your valley." The other riders shifted hands, moving to weapons with practiced ease. Josiah counted 2 rifles, 3 men with pistols. Good odds if they were regular cowboys. Bad odds if they were what he suspected hired guns, who'd killed before and would sleep just fine after doing it again. "Tracks wash out in storms like that," Josiah said. "Could have gone anywhere." "Mr. McBride," Pike's voice dropped, becoming almost conversational. "I'm going to make this simple. The woman belongs to Garrett Blackwood. That's not an opinion or a negotiation, it's a fact. Now you can hand her over peaceful like, take your reward, and go back to your hermit existence. Or, he paused, letting the silence speak. Or we burn this place to the ground, shoot you for harboring a fugitive, and take her anyway. Mr. Blackwood has papers, you see. Legal guardianship due to her brother's debts and her own mental instability. We're within our rights. From inside the cabin, Josiah heard Isabel's sharp intake of breath. Legal papers. Of course Blackwood would have covered that angle. Men like him always made sure the law was on their side, even when what they did had nothing to do with justice. "Let me see these papers," Josiah said. Pike reached into his coat, producing a folded document. "By all means. Though I should mention Sheriff Wade back in Cedar Falls has already validated them, as has Judge Morrison. You remember Judge Morrison, don't you? From your lawman days," Josiah remembered. Morrison had been one of the few honest judges in the territory, which meant if he'd signed off on this, Blackwood had either bought him or threatened him. Either way, it didn't matter. Legal papers didn't make a forced marriage right. "I'll need a minute to read this," Josiah said. "Come on up to the porch, just you." Pike hesitated, then nodded to his men. He walked forward with the confidence of a man who'd never met a situation he couldn't handle with money or bullets. When he reached the porch steps, Josiah saw the ivory-handled Colt on his hip, the Derringer barely visible in his vest pocket. A careful man, but not careful enough. "The papers," Josiah said, holding out his hand. As Pike extended the document, Josiah moved. Not for his gun, but for Pike himself. His left hand grabbed Pike's wrist while his right brought the rifle barrel up under the man's chin. Before anyone could react, he'd spun Pike around, using him as a shield between himself and the other riders. "Nobody moves," Josiah called out. "Your boss here has a sensitive trigger finger, and I'd hate for him to have an accident." The riders froze hands on weapons, but not drawing. They were professionals, all right. They knew better than to risk their meal ticket. "This is a mistake, McBride," Pike said through gritted teeth. "You can't fight Blackwood. No one can." Not fighting him, just evening the odds for a conversation. Josiah pressed the rifle barrel harder against Pike's throat. "Isabel, come on out here." She emerged from the cabin, the Navy Colt steady in her hand. In the morning light, despite the borrowed dress and tangled hair, she looked every inch the lady she'd been raised to be. But there was steel in her spine now, forged by desperation and betrayal. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. "I see your manners haven't improved." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Miss Hartford, your fiancé is worried sick." "My fiancé?" Isabel laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Is that what we're calling the man who bought me like cattle, who had my brother beaten bloody for trying to protect me? Your brother brought this on himself. His debts are his own. I'm not property to be bartered." She stepped closer, and Josiah saw Pike flinch. "Tell Garrett I'm not coming back. Not today, not ever." "You don't have a choice," Pike said. "Where will you go? Who'll protect you? This broken-down ex-lawman, he couldn't even protect his own wife." The words hit their mark. Josiah felt the old shame rise like bile, but before he could respond, Isabel spoke. "At least he's not the one who put bruises on my wrists. At least he offered shelter instead of chains." She raised the Colt, pointing it directly at Pike's face. "And at least he knows the difference between a woman and property." The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string. 4 armed men their boss held, hostage a woman with every reason to pull the trigger, and Josiah caught in the middle trying to find a way out that didn't end in blood. That's when they heard the horses, not from the east this time, but from the north. A lone rider coming fast, kicking up dust clouds in the morning light. As the figure grew closer, Josiah recognized the lanky frame and the deputy's star glinting on his vest. Sam Hutchins, all of 22 years old, and green as spring grass, reined up his lathered horse just outside the circle of tension. His eyes went wide, taking in the scene. Pike held at gunpoint, the other riders with hands on their weapons, Isabel looking like an avenging angel in a borrowed dress. "Mr. McBride," Sam called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Pike, seems I'm interrupting something." "Deputy," Pike said smoothly, despite the rifle at his throat. "Perfect timing. We're attempting to retrieve Miss Hartford here, who's suffering from mental distress. Mr. McBride is interfering with a legal recovery." Sam dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "That's so. Well, Mr. Pike, I'm afraid I've got news that might change things. There's been a development regarding Mr. Blackwood's business interests." "What kind of development?" Pike's voice had lost some of its confidence. "The kind that involves a federal marshal riding in from Denver with a warrant. Seems the government's taken an interest in Mr. Blackwood's mining operations. Something about claim jumping and intimidation of competitors." Sam's boyish face tried for stern, but couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. "Marshal Graves should be here by nightfall. Wants to talk to anyone who might have information about Mr. Blackwood's methods." The silence that followed was heavy with shifting possibilities. Josiah felt Pike tense against the rifle barrel, could practically hear the man's mind working through options. "This has nothing to do with Miss Hartford," Pike said finally. "Maybe not," Sam agreed. "But Marshal Graves, he's thorough, likes to look into all aspects of a man's business, and a forced marriage, well, that might be the kind of thing he'd find interesting." Isabel lowered the Colt slightly. "A federal marshal?" "Yes, ma'am, Theodore Graves himself. They say he's cleaned up more corrupt towns than any other lawman west of the Mississippi." Sam's eyes met hers with surprising steadiness. "Also say he's got no patience for men who abuse women, regardless of what papers they might have." One of Pike's men called out, "Boss, what do you want us to do?" Josiah made the decision for him. He released Pike with a shove that sent him stumbling forward. "Take your men and ride out. Tell Blackwood the woman's not here. Tell him whatever you want. But if you come back before that marshal arrives, I'll forget I used to believe in due process." Pike straightened his coat, his face dark with fury. "This isn't over, McBride. You've made an enemy today." "Get in line," Josiah replied. "It's a long one." Pike mounted his horse with stiff dignity, but before riding off he looked directly at Isabel. "You think you've won something here. Garrett Blackwood doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." "At least it'll be my life," Isabel said, "not his." The 5 riders disappeared over the ridge, but Josiah knew they'd be back. Men like Pike didn't give up easily, and Blackwood wouldn't let this insult stand. They'd bought time, nothing more. "That was brave what you did," Sam said, approaching the porch. "Also mighty foolish. Pike's killed 3 men that I know of, probably more." "Sometimes foolish and right are the same thing," Josiah replied. He turned to Isabel. "You should go inside. We need to talk about what comes next." She nodded but paused at the door. "Thank you, both of you. I know what you're risking." After she'd gone inside, Sam pushed his hat back, revealing a worried face. "I wasn't lying about the marshal, but I might have exaggerated his interest in Blackwood. Truth is, he's coming to investigate a series of claim disputes. Might not care one whit about a forced marriage." "Then we'd better make sure he cares," Josiah said. "What else do you know about Blackwood, something that might interest a federal lawman?" Sam glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "There's talk about a girl named Mary Elizabeth Turner. She was supposed to marry Blackwood about 2 years back. Same situation, brother's debts, forced arrangement. She tried to run, too. What happened to her? Found her body in the Sweetwater River. Ruled a suicide, but," Sam shrugged, "nobody who knew Mary Elizabeth believed she'd kill herself. She was a fighter like Miss Hartford in there. Josiah felt the old instinct stirring the lawman's need to connect dots and build a case. Any witnesses' evidence. Nothing that stuck. Sheriff Wade made sure of that. But there might be people willing to talk now, especially if a federal marshal's asking the questions. You're taking a big risk going against Blackwood. He owns half the law in this territory. Sam straightened, and for a moment Josiah could see the lawman he might become. Maybe so. But my pa taught me that a badge means something. Means standing up for folks who can't stand up for themselves. I'd forgotten that for a while, but seeing Miss Hartford today, seeing the fear in her eyes, he trailed off. It ain't right, Mr. McBride. None of it's right. Josiah studied the young deputy, remembering when he'd felt that same fire, that same belief that one man could make a difference. Before he'd learned how the world really worked, before betrayal and loss had driven him into these mountains. You'd better head back to town, he said finally. Keep your ears open, and deputy, watch your back. Blackwood plays for keeps. As Sam rode away, Josiah stood on his porch looking out at the land he'd thought would be his sanctuary from the world's ugliness. But the world had found him anyway in the form of a desperate woman in a wedding dress. And now he had a choice to make: maintain his carefully constructed isolation, or remember what it felt like to fight for something besides his own survival. Inside the cabin, Isabel sat by the window watching the horizon where Pike and his men had disappeared. They'll be back, she said without turning. Yes, with more men. Probably. She finally looked at him, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I've brought death to your door. I should leave, find somewhere. You'll stay. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Running won't solve anything. Didn't work for me, won't work for you. Why? She stood facing him directly. Why risk everything for a stranger? You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Josiah was quiet for a long moment, remembering another woman who'd needed help, who'd trusted the law to protect her. Maybe because I've got debts of my own, the kind you can't pay with money. He told her about Mary Elizabeth then, about finding her body, about the investigation that went nowhere, about Sheriff Wade's new house, and sudden disinterest in justice. He talked until his throat was raw, purging years of guilt and fury he'd thought were buried beneath mountain stone and solitude. When he finished, Isabel crossed the space between them. She didn't speak, just took his weathered hand in both of hers and held on like she was drowning, and he was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. We'll face them together, she said quietly, whatever comes. And standing there in his cabin, holding hands with a woman he'd known less than a day, Josiah felt something he'd thought was dead forever begin to stir in his chest. Not love, it was too soon, and they were both too damaged for that, but perhaps something just as dangerous: hope. The sun hung low on the horizon when they came back, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. This time Garrett Blackwood himself rode at the head of 15 men, his silver hair gleaming in the dying light. Josiah watched from the window as they approached, noting the deliberate spacing, the way they'd already started to fan out to surround the cabin. He brought a small army, Isabel said from beside him. She'd changed back into her ruined wedding dress, cleaned and dried as best they could manage. I won't let him think I'm ashamed of running, she'd explained. 16 men, Josiah corrected, spotting another rider coming from the south. They're not taking chances this time. He'd spent the afternoon preparing checking weapons, fortifying positions, trying to turn his simple cabin into something defensible. But looking at the forces arrayed against them, he knew it wouldn't be enough, not in a straight fight. There's still time, he said quietly. You could slip out the back, make for the trees. I'll hold them here, buy you time to... We've had this conversation. Her hand found his fingers intertwining with natural ease. "I'm done running." Blackwood stopped his horse just outside rifle range, sitting his mount like a general surveying a battlefield. Even from this distance, Josiah could see he was everything Pike had tried: to be powerful, controlled, dangerous in the way of men who'd never been denied anything they wanted. "Mr. McBride," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. "I'm Garrett Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Josiah stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. Man can't own what was never his to begin with. "Ah, a philosopher. How refreshing." Blackwood dismounted with surprising grace for a man his age. "I've heard about you, the lawman who lost his faith." "Tragic story, really. Your wife, wasn't it? Found her with another man." The words were designed to wound, and they did. But Josiah had learned to live with that pain, to let it flow through him without breaking his composure. "We're not here to discuss ancient history," he said. "No, but history is so instructive." Blackwood took a few steps forward, his men tensing behind him. "You see, I know all about men like you, idealists who think the world should bend to their notion of justice. But the world doesn't care about justice, Mr. McBride. It cares about power. And I have it while you have a rundown cabin and principles that couldn't even keep your wife faithful." "At least I never had to buy a woman's affection." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, the first crack in his urbane facade. "I don't buy affection. I invest in futures. Isabel's brother made poor choices. I offered a solution that would benefit everyone." "Everyone except Isabel." "Women rarely know what's best for them. They're emotional creatures given to hysteria and poor judgment." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Take your wife, for instance." The rifle shot split the air before Josiah realized he'd pulled the trigger. The bullet kicked up dust inches from Blackwood's boot, close enough to make his point without starting the massacre that would surely follow if he'd aimed to kill. "Next one goes higher," Josiah said into the sudden silence. "You've said your piece, now get off my land." Blackwood didn't flinch, didn't even step back. If anything, his smile widened. "There's the lawman I've heard about, the one who shot Tom Morrison's brother back in Cedar Falls. Claimed self-defense, but we both know the truth, don't we? You've got blood on your hands just like the rest of us." Behind him, his men had drawn weapons, waiting for the order to turn the cabin into kindling, but Blackwood raised a hand, holding them back. "I'm going to make you an offer," he said. "One time only. Give me Isabel, and I'll forget this happened. More than that, I'll pay you $10,000. Enough to leave this place, start over somewhere civilized. Maybe find another wife, one who will appreciate a man of principle." "No sale. 20,000. Get off my land." Blackwood sighed theatrically. "You know I actually respect you, McBride. It takes courage to stand against impossible odds for something you believe in. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless." He turned back toward his horse. "Which is why I'm going to give you one last chance to see reason." He nodded to one of his men who rode forward leading another horse. Slumped in the saddle, hands tied to the pommel, was a young man who looked like he'd been used as a practice dummy for bare-knuckle fighters. His face was swollen beyond recognition, clothes torn and bloody. "Daniel!" Isabel gasped from the doorway, starting forward before Josiah caught her arm. "Your brother's been my guest since yesterday," Blackwood said conversationally. "He's been telling me the most interesting stories about how you plan to run, where you might go, who might help you. He was reluctant to share at first, but Marcus here has a gift for encouraging conversation." Marcus Pike grinned from his position among the riders, knuckles still bloody from his work. "Let him go," Isabel called out, her voice breaking. "He's not part of this." "Oh, but he is." Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the predator beneath. He's the reason we're all here. His debts, his weakness, his failure, and now his sister's stubbornness is going to cost him everything. He drew his pistol with casual efficiency and placed the barrel against Daniel's temple. The young man moaned, barely conscious, but aware enough to know death was a heartbeat away. "Simple trade," Blackwood said. "You for him. Come willingly, honor the marriage contract, and your brother lives. Refuse." He cocked the hammer. "Well, his blood will be on your hands, yours and Mr. McBride's." Josiah felt Isabel trembling beside him, felt her world collapsing into an impossible choice: save her brother by sacrificing herself, or watch him die for her freedom. It was the kind of choice Blackwood specialized in: no good options, only degrees of devastation. "I need a minute," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "1 minute," Blackwood agreed. "Then I start shooting. Your brother first, then McBride, then anyone else who gets in my way. And you'll come with me anyway, only with more blood on your conscience." Isabel turned to Josiah, and in her eyes he saw the same resignation he'd seen that morning, the look of someone making peace with an unbearable decision. "I have to," she whispered. "I can't watch him die because of me. He's bluffing." "No." She touched his face gently. "You know he's not. Men like him don't bluff. They don't have to." Josiah's mind raced, searching for options, for some way out of this trap. But Blackwood had played it perfectly: superior numbers, a hostage, legal papers, to justify whatever came next. The smart play was to let her go to survive and fight another day. But Josiah McBride was done with smart plays. "Wait," he called out. "I've got a counteroffer." Blackwood looked amused. "You have nothing I want except the woman." "You sure about that?" Josiah reached into his shirt, pulling out a leather wallet. "Because I've got something here that might change your mind. Documents from a safety deposit box in Denver. The real ownership papers for the Sweetwater mine. The ones that prove you killed Harrison Fletcher and forged his signature on the transfer deed." The amusement vanished from Blackwood's face. "You're lying. Mary Elizabeth Turner found them. That's why you had her killed. But she made copies, first hid them away, told me where to find them before she died. It was a desperate gambit, a lie built on fragments of truth and speculation. But Josiah had learned to read men during his years wearing a badge, and the flash of uncertainty in Blackwood's eyes told him he'd struck close to something real. "Even if that were true," Blackwood said slowly, "those papers would be long gone by now." "Would they?" Josiah pulled out a folded document, holding it up so the dying light caught the official-looking seals. It was actually the deed to his own land, but at this distance, in this light, it could be anything. "Mary Elizabeth was smarter than you gave her credit for, smart enough to know she needed insurance." The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily, unsure what was happening but sensing the sudden change in dynamics. Even Pike looked uncertain, his usual sneer replaced by calculation. "Here's my offer," Josiah continued. "Let the boy go, ride away, and don't come back. In return, these papers stay buried. And if I refuse, then I've already made arrangements. If I don't check in by tomorrow noon, copies go to the federal marshal, the territorial governor, and 3 newspapers. Another lie, but delivered with the conviction of truth. Your empire falls apart, and you spend whatever years you've got left fighting federal charges." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, weighing truth against bluff, risk against reward. Finally he smiled, a predator's smile that promised this wasn't over. "You're bluffing," he said. "But you're also right about one thing. I am a businessman, and businessmen understand cost versus profit." He holstered his gun. "Release the boy." One of his men cut Daniel's bonds, and the young man slumped forward, barely catching himself on the saddle horn. "But understand this," Blackwood continued. "You've bought a reprieve, not a victory. Those papers, real or imagined, won't protect you forever. And Isabel," his eyes found hers with possessive intensity, "you can't run far enough or long enough. I'll find you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when I do, there won't be any negotiations." He mounted his horse with the same controlled grace he'd shown throughout his men falling into formation behind him. But as they prepared to ride out, the sound of approaching horses made everyone freeze. From the north, riding hard despite the growing darkness, came a group of men wearing federal badges. At their head rode a grizzled lawman with eyes like chips of flint and a face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Marshal Theodore Graves had arrived earlier than expected. "Evening, gentlemen." Graves called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Seems I'm interrupting something. Mr. Blackwood, isn't it? I've been hoping to have a conversation with you." The arrival of the federal lawman shifted everything. Blackwood's superior numbers suddenly didn't mean as much. When faced with the possibility of federal charges, his men hired guns, loyal to money rather than principle, began calculating new odds. "Marshal," Blackwood said smoothly, "what brings you to this god-forsaken corner of the territory?" "Oh, various matters. Mining disputes, some interesting questions about water rights, and—" Graves's eyes found Isabel. "Reports of a young woman being forced into marriage against her will. Federal government takes a dim view of what some might call human trafficking." "I have legal papers." "I'm sure you do." Graves rode closer, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "You probably have all sorts of papers. Men like you always do. But papers don't make a wrong thing right, and they surely don't impress me much." For the first time since he'd arrived, Blackwood looked genuinely uncertain. Federal law was one of the few things his money couldn't simply buy off, and Graves had a reputation for being incorruptible. "There's been a misunderstanding," Blackwood said. "Miss Hartford suffered a nervous episode. We were simply trying to ensure her safe return." "By threatening to shoot her brother?" Graves asked mildly. "Interesting medical technique." The standoff had shifted again, become something larger than just one woman's freedom. It was about law versus money, justice versus power, the Old West versus the New. Deputy Sam Hutchins rode forward from among the federal party. "Marshal, I've got 3 witnesses willing to testify about Mary Elizabeth Turner, about how she died, who ordered it, and why." Blackwood's face went still as stone. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not," Graves agreed, "but I can sure make your life complicated while I try. And something tells me a man with your many business interests can't afford too much federal scrutiny." The two forces faced each other in the dying light. Blackwood's hired guns against federal lawman money, against authority, the old ways, against the possibility of justice. Josiah kept his rifle ready, knowing how quickly such situations could explode into violence. It was Isabel who broke the stalemate. She walked down from the porch, moving past Josiah before he could stop her, and approached her brother's horse. Daniel was conscious enough to recognize her, reaching out with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered through split lips. "I'm so sorry, Belle. This is all my fault." "Hush," she said, helping him down from the saddle. "We're family. We take care of each other." Then she turned to face Blackwood, standing straight despite her brother's weight against her side. "You want to know the difference between you and people like Mr. McBride. He helped a stranger in a storm because it was right. You would have let me freeze because there was no profit in kindness." "Kindness is a luxury I can't afford," Blackwood replied. "No," Isabel said. "Kindness is the only thing worth affording. It's what separates us from animals. And you, Mr. Blackwood, for all your money and power, are less human than any creature in these mountains." The words hit their mark. Blackwood's face darkened with fury, his hand moving toward his gun, but Graves was faster, his Colt appearing in his hand like magic. "I wouldn't," the marshal said quietly. "See, I've been hoping you'd give me an excuse, make my job easier." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke before a fire. Then Blackwood forced his hand away from his weapon, forced his face back into its mask of control. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked their earlier conviction. "Yes," Graves said, "it is. You're going to ride away now, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to forget about Miss Hartford and her debts. You're going to be too busy dealing with federal investigators to worry about forced marriages. And if I hear you've so much as looked in her direction again, I'll personally see you hanged for Mary Elizabeth Turner's murder, evidence or no evidence." The threat was probably illegal, certainly beyond Graves's actual authority, but delivered with such quiet certainty, it carried more weight than any legal document. Blackwood looked around at his men, seeing the calculation in their eyes. Pike and a few others might stay loyal, but the rest were already distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with a federal investigation. "Mount up," he said finally. "We're leaving." As his men prepared to ride out, Blackwood locked eyes with Josiah one last time. "You've made a powerful enemy today, McBride. Both of you have. I don't forget." "Neither do I," Josiah replied. "Every time I think of Mary Elizabeth Turner, I remember exactly what kind of man you are." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He mounted his horse and led his diminished force away into the darkness, leaving behind only dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Marshal Graves watched them go, then turned to Josiah. "You know he'll try again. Maybe not directly, but men like that don't give up easy." "I know," Josiah said, "but that's tomorrow's problem." Graves nodded, then looked at Isabel, who was still supporting her brother. "Ma'am, I'll need a full statement about what happened. Deputy Hutchins says you were forced into this situation against your will." "I'll tell you everything," Isabel promised. "About the debts, the threats, all of it, and about Mary Elizabeth, what I know of her story." "Good. With testimony and what we already have might be enough to put Blackwood away for good." Graves motioned to his men. "Let's get that boy to town, find a doctor. You folks can follow when you're ready." As the federal party prepared to leave, with Daniel Sam Hutchins lingered behind. "Mr. McBride, Miss Hartford, what you did today took real courage, standing up to Blackwood like that." "Wasn't courage," Josiah said, "just stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing." Sam tipped his hat to Isabel. "Ma'am, your brother's going to be fine. I'll make sure of it." After they'd all gone, Josiah and Isabel stood alone in the gathering darkness. The crisis had passed, the immediate danger resolved, but something fundamental had changed. The walls Josiah had built around his life had crumbled, and he wasn't sure what came next. "Thank you," Isabel said quietly. "You saved my life. In more ways than one. You saved yourself. I just provided the sanctuary." She turned to face him fully, and in the last light of day, he could see the strength that had carried her through everything. "What happens now? Now?" Josiah looked at his cabin, his carefully maintained isolation that no longer seemed like safety but like a prison. "Now we figure out if two broken people can build something new from the pieces." "I'd like that," she said, taking his hand, "if you'll have me." He squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the calluses from her desperate flight, the strength in her grip. "Reckon this place could use a woman's touch. Been too long since these walls heard laughter." "I should warn you," Isabel said with the ghost of a smile, "I can't cook worth a damn." "I should warn you," Josiah replied, "I talk to my horse more than most people." "Then we'll learn together?" and standing there in the darkness, two souls who'd been shattered by the world's cruelty found in each other the possibility of wholeness. It wouldn't be easy. Blackwood was still out there, still dangerous, and they both carried scars that might never fully heal. But for the first time in years, Josiah McBride had something to fight for besides mere survival. The stars came out one by one like hope returning to a darkened sky. 6 months later, the Wyoming Territory had dressed itself in autumn glory. Golden aspens trembled in the breeze, and the mountains wore their first dusting of snow like wedding veils. Josiah McBride stood in front of the small church in Cedar Falls, fidgeting with his string tie and wondering how he'd let himself be talked into this. "Stop fussing," Sam Hutchins said from beside him. The young deputy had filled out some in the past months, grown into his badge with a confidence that came from doing right when it mattered. "You look fine." "I look like a store clerk playing dress-up," Josiah muttered, but there was no real complaint in it. He'd have worn a circus costume if that's what Isabel wanted. After everything they'd been through, standing in front of a preacher seemed like the easiest thing in the world. The church was full, which surprised him. He'd expected maybe a dozen people, Sam Marshall Graves, Doc Winters, who'd nursed Daniel back to health. Instead, it seemed like half the territory had shown up, ranchers who'd kept quiet under Blackwood's rule, townspeople who'd found their courage when the federal investigation started, even some of Blackwood's former men who'd turned state's evidence rather than go down with their boss. "Nervous?" Sam asked. "Terrified," Josiah admitted. "Last time I stood in a church like this, I was young and stupid enough to think love conquered everything." "Maybe you were just loving the wrong person," Sam suggested. "Or maybe you needed to go through hell to appreciate heaven." Before Josiah could respond, the organist struck up the wedding march. The congregation rose, turning toward the back of the church, and Josiah felt his breath catch. Isabel appeared in the doorway like something out of a dream. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and restored, but it wasn't the dress that made people gasp. It was the joy radiating from her face, the smile that transformed her from a pretty woman into something luminous. Daniel walked beside her, still thin from his ordeal, but standing straight and proud. He'd been working Josiah's ranch for 3 months now, learning the kind of honest labor that didn't involve cards or dice. The boy had potential once freed from the shadow of easy money and bad choices. As Isabel came down the aisle, Josiah found himself thinking about second chances. 6 months ago, he'd been a ghost, haunting his own life, convinced that solitude was the only safety left in a world that specialized in betrayal. Then a desperate woman in a ruined wedding dress had collapsed on his porch and changed everything. When she reached him, Isabel handed her bouquet to Mrs. Hutchins, Sam's mother, who'd taken her in like a daughter, and took Josiah's hands. Her fingers were steady, no trace of the desperate trembling from that first night. "You clean up nice, Mr. McBride," she whispered. "You're worth cleaning up for Miss Hartford." Reverend Wright cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness something I thought I'd never see. Josiah McBride, willing to let another human being into his life." Soft laughter rippled through the congregation. Even Josiah smiled. The Reverend had earned the right to gentle mockery, having made the trip to the ranch a dozen times over the summer, slowly helping both of them work through their ghosts. "But more than that," Wright continued, "we're here to witness the power of redemption, the proof that broken things can be mended, that love can grow in the most unlikely soil, and that sometimes the very wounds that nearly destroy us become the cracks where the light gets in." The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional. But when Josiah spoke the words "for better or worse, in sickness and in health," he felt their weight differently than he had the first time. Now he knew what worse looked like, had lived through sickness of the soul. The promises meant more when you understood their cost. "Do you, Isabel Hartford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said, clear and certain, "with all my heart." "Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife." Wright smiled. "Josiah, you may kiss your bride." Their kiss was tender, a promise sealed with the sweetness of survival and the hope of futures neither had dared imagine 6 months ago. The congregation erupted in applause, and Josiah was surprised to find his eyes burning with unshed tears. As they walked back down the aisle together, Josiah caught sight of a familiar figure in the back row. Marcus Pike sat alone, his scarred face unreadable. Their eyes met for a moment, and Pike gave the slightest nod before slipping out the door. Later, Josiah would find an envelope on their wagon seat, containing a single sheet of paper, Blackwood's signed confession to Mary Elizabeth Turner's murder, witnessed by Pike himself. The revelation would come too late to save Blackwood, who'd taken his own life rather than face federal prison. But it would bring closure to Mary Elizabeth's family and finally lay to rest the ghost that had haunted Josiah's failures as a lawman. The reception was held at the Hutchins Ranch, tables groaning under the weight of food donated by neighbors who'd found their courage when Blackwood's empire crumbled. Josiah, who'd spent 12 years avoiding social gatherings, found himself swept into conversations, congratulations, and more human warmth than he'd experienced in over a decade. "Strange, isn't it?" Marshall Graves appeared at his elbow, cup of punch in hand. "How one act of kindness can ripple out, change everything." "Wasn't trying to change anything," Josiah said. "Just couldn't let her freeze." "That's what makes it powerful. The unplanned mercies, the instinctive goodness." Graves was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, McBride. Seen a lot of darkness. But days like this remind me why the fight's worth it." Across the yard, Isabel was dancing with Daniel, laughing as he spun her awkwardly to the fiddle music. She'd kept her word to the investigators, testified about everything despite threats from Blackwood's remaining associates. Her courage had inspired others to come forward, creating an avalanche that buried the corruption which had poisoned the territory for years. "She's good for you," Graves observed. "Better than I deserve." "Maybe. Or maybe you're exactly what each other needed. Sometimes the best matches aren't between perfect people, but between people whose broken edges fit together." As if sensing his gaze, Isabel looked over and smiled, that radiant expression that still made Josiah's chest tight. She said something to Daniel, then made her way through the crowd to her husband's side. "Marshall Graves was just philosophizing about broken edges," Josiah said as she slipped her arm through his. "Broken edges make the most interesting patterns," Isabel replied, "like quilts pieced from scraps, stronger and more beautiful than something made from whole cloth." "Speaking of which," Graves said, "I've got a wedding present for you both." He pulled out an envelope. "Job offer. Federal marshal position based right here in Cedar Falls. Seems the territory could use more lawmen who understand the difference between legal and right." Josiah stared at the envelope. "I left that life behind." "Did you? Seems to me you've been practicing law all along, just without the badge." Graves set the envelope on the table. "Think about it. Position comes with a house in town, steady pay, and the chance to make sure what happened to Mary Elizabeth and almost happened to Isabel doesn't happen to anyone else." After Graves walked away, Josiah and Isabel stood quietly, watching their neighbors celebrate. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Josiah of that terrible night 6 months ago when a different storm had brought salvation disguised as catastrophe. "You should take it," Isabel said quietly. "The ranch will still be there. Daniel can run it. He's learned well. And we could spend winters in town, summers at the cabin." She turned to face him fully. You're a good man, Josiah McBride, too good to hide from the world any longer. I hid because I failed, because I couldn't protect. You protected me. She touched his face gently. And you'll protect others, not because you're perfect, but because you understand the cost of looking away. That night in the cabin that had been his fortress of solitude, Josiah held his wife and marveled at how different the space felt. The same rough walls now seemed warm rather than confining. The silence that had once been his only companion was now filled with the sound of shared breathing, the whisper of skin against skin, the quiet words lovers exchange in darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "That night choosing to trust a stranger?" "Never." Isabel traced patterns on his chest, her touch light as butterfly wings. "Do you regret opening your door?" "Only that it took a storm to make me do it." They made love with the tenderness of survivors, each touch a celebration of life chosen over mere existence. Afterward, as Isabel slept in his arms, Josiah stared at the ceiling and thought about second chances. He thought about Mary Elizabeth Turner, who'd never gotten hers, about his first wife, whose betrayal had taught him that love could be a lie, about the badge he'd thrown away when the system failed. And he thought about the woman beside him who'd crashed into his life, wearing a ruined wedding dress and carrying enough courage to face down a man who'd terrorized an entire territory. Maybe Graves was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. 2 weeks later, Josiah McBride stood in the sheriff's office, raising his right hand as Judge Morrison, one of the few honest judges who'd survived the corruption purge, administered the oath. Isabel stood beside him, her hand on the Bible, adding her promise to his. "Do you solemnly swear to uphold the law and protect the innocent, so help you God?" "I do." The badge felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with his failures and his promises. But Isabel's smile made it bearable, reminded him that some things were worth the weight. Their life settled into rhythms both new and familiar. Winters in town where Josiah worked to rebuild trust in the law, while Isabel taught school and helped establish a shelter for women fleeing bad situations. Summers at the ranch where the mountains reminded them both of that violent spring when everything changed. Daniel thrived under responsibility, turning the ranch profitable while courting the minister's daughter with an earnestness that made Josiah remember his own youth. Sam Hutchins became Josiah's chief deputy, the two of them forming a partnership based on shared ideals and mutual respect. 5 years passed. The town grew, the territory moved toward statehood, and the wild edge of the frontier slowly gave way to civilization. But some things remained constant. The mountains endured, the storms still came each spring, and Josiah McBride still remembered the night a desperate woman sought sanctuary at his door. On their 5th anniversary, Isabel gave him a gift that made him weep, a daguerreotype of Mary Elizabeth Turner recovered from her effects. "So you remember why the work matters," she said simply. That night, as spring rain drummed against their windows, Josiah held his wife and thought about the strange turnings of fate. How a gambling debt had led to a forced marriage, which led to a midnight flight, which led to a collision between two broken souls who discovered they could build something whole together. "What are you thinking?" Isabel asked, sensing his wakeful mood. "About storms," he said. "How they destroy, but also how they wash things clean, make room for new growth." Very philosophical, Marshall McBride. "Must be your influence. I was a much simpler man before you came along." "No," she said, turning to kiss him. "You were always this man. You just needed someone to remind you." Outside, the storm continued its ancient song, but inside, they were warm and safe and home. The rancher was no longer alone. The bride had found her freedom, and in the space between them grew a love strong enough to weather any storm. Some love stories begin with sunshine and promises. But the best ones, the ones that last, begin with two people willing to open a door despite their fear, to offer shelter, despite their wounds, to choose hope, despite their history. And in the Wyoming territory, where the mountains touched the sky and the storms came every spring, Josiah and Isabel McBride built a life that proved sometimes the greatest courage is simply being willing to try again.